undergrad at the University of Oregon, and he went to law school at Georgetown, where he was on the law review. He has published 8 books. The Rights of Law Enforcement Officers is, our Bible in the workplace. We use it all the time. His practice involves fact-finding hearings, interest arbitration hearings, grievance arbitration hearings. He's represented 50,000 public safety employees. He's done over 50 large-scale class actions. He's an expert in the Fair Labor Standards Act. He publishes a monthly newsletter called the Public Safety Labor News. He owns a group called the Public Safety Labor Group, and every month when that newsletter comes out, he publishes all of the latest articles that are relevant to our areas of practice. But above all else, Will is an excellent speaker. He really knows how to convey the cases that he's talking about in a way that's understandable, that you can apply to your practice. So without any further ado, I don't want to take up any more time. I just want to welcome Will to this group, and I want to thank you very much for agreeing to present today.
Hey, thanks, Gwen. I appreciate it. Everybody, I'm going to share screens so we can go through a PowerPoint. If you have any questions, post them in the chat room, and I will be interrupted. I think it's Mita who's going to do it. And we'll ask the questions and I'll try to answer them as we go along. And I think that will be the best way to approach this. So I'm going to be talking about, my main topic is going to be what I see to be the completely changing environment in the public safety labor world. In particular, in the last year, more generally in the last 3 years, and even more generally than that, going back 7 years. And I think the challenge that we are facing, the challenges we are facing in public safety recruitment and retention are unlike anything any of us have seen in our careers. And they are daunting challenges, challenges to which at the moment, we don't seem to have very good solutions. But that's not what I want to start talking about. I just want everybody to have kind of a reminder that there are 3 recent cases that everybody ought to be thinking about. And the first one is this one from the Supreme Court in June of 2022. It's a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. No doubt you've heard something about it. It involves a part-time football coach who was on year-to-year contracts, deciding that he would lead his team in prayers at the 50-yard line after games were concluded. And so what in the world would that have to do with public safety free speech? Well, the Supreme Court held by a 6-3 margin, and you can see the alignment of the justices there. This is the conservative wing, now 2/3 of the Supreme Court joining. All the liberal wing dissented, all 3. The majority found that the coach's speech was protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. So how do we get to public safety, public sector free speech? And here's how we do it. The law with respect to public employee free speech dramatically changed in 2006 in a decision from the Supreme Court called Garcetti versus Sabalos. That was a 5-4 decision. You see, it's the conservative wing of the Supreme Court again, deciding that case. Up until 2006, we thought we had a pretty good handle on public employee free speech. We thought there was sort of a pantheon of free speech rights, depending upon the topic. The more that something was a matter of public interest, the more you thought the speech would be protected. If you got to pure whistleblowing speech, where an employee is calling out the criminal conduct of a fellow public employee, that would be at the top of the pantheon. Garcetti itself involved a prosecutor, a low-level prosecutor, who became convinced that a deputy sheriff that he was working with was committing perjury on search warrant affidavits. So Sabalos, that's what his name was, wrote a memo and put it through the chain of command to go up to the district attorney in Los Angeles County. As a result, we are to assume, because the case was decided on a motion to dismiss, as a result, he was transferred. And he had other sort of adverse job consequences. If you've ever been to Los Angeles, you'll know the significance of a transfer there. They call it freeway therapy. A transfer could potentially increase an employee's one-way commute an hour and a half or 2 hours. And this transfer, the court assumes, is adverse employment action for the purposes of Section 1983. The court upheld the decision to transfer. And the court gave us a completely new rule of free speech in public employment. And this is a rule that some federal court of appeals subsequently referred to as a revolution in constitutional law. And indeed it was. The court held that if speech is within the ordinary job duties of the employee, it has zero constitutional protection. Now, obviously, there may be protections through the just cause provisions of a collective bargaining agreement, through civil service rules. This is all we're talking about here is the First Amendment, which is probably the most effective remedy with respect to discipline for speech that public employees had. You cannot overstate the impact of Garcetti versus Sabalos. Gwen mentioned that I write a book called The Rights of Law Enforcement Officers. It's now in its 8th edition. Every 5 years I rewrite it, and when I do, I try to collect all of the cases decided in the previous 5 years pertaining to every topic in the book. And I did that with respect to the free speech cases. And in the last update to the book, which is post-Garcetti, of those 5 years of cases, law enforcement employees lost over 99% of their free speech cases. And you can point directly to Garcetti versus Sabalos. You had employees who were fired for testifying truthfully in internal affairs. And a court said, is testifying truthfully before internal affairs within the ordinary job duties of a police officer? Yes. If so, speech unprotected under the First Amendment. You had an employee, this one's from Ohio, a canine officer, who was fired for sending a memo through the chain of command warning about cutbacks in training and putting the employer on notice that there might be increased liability from dog bites. The court said, is writing such a memo ordinarily within the job duties of law enforcement officers? Yes. If so, under Garcetti, speech not protected in the First Amendment. Reporting the criminal conduct of fellow employees. So just imagine what was going on in the George Floyd situation with the witnesses there. If they had reported that and had been fired, would that termination be upheld on a free speech basis? Absolutely, because reporting criminal conduct ordinarily within the job duties of the public employee. So that's Garcetti versus Sabalos. Now take us to the current time with the Kennedy case. Kennedy, the coach, was on duty. He was a coach of high school students. He acted as a mentor towards the high school students. He didn't just pray after the game. He made religious lectures, and he went on the news media to make the same sort of statements. All sorts of disruption results. You have people who are spectators who rush the field in order to join the prayers or to protest the prayers, knocking over members of the high school band in the result. the local group of Satanists in Bremerton, Washington, you know this is coming, said, well, if he's praying this week, we want to pray to Satan the next week. So all sorts of disruption that the employer suffers as a result of this. And the court ends up finding that Garcetti does not bar the coach's lawsuit for violation of free speech. Why? Because the court says the speech was not endorsed by the employer. And the fact that he was on duty, the fact that these students were in a subordinate role to him in terms of educational instruction, none of that converted this into job-related speech. Result, 6-3 vote, speech protected under the First Amendment. You can see why I think that the door is now open under Garcetti, open more than just a small crack. The question will be, what does the Supreme Court do with this once it gets an employment case? And it will, right? It'll get a free speech case. It'll probably be a social media case. What will the court do with that? We'll see, because the 6-3 majority of the Supreme Court, not friends of employees, right? We know that. The second case you ought to be aware of, and this is one that should have you looking at your social media policies right away, is a federal court decision out of Arizona from earlier this year. It involves a SWAT team member by the name of Christopher Turiano, who during a protest, President Trump had come to town and there was a disruption, sort of a mini riot happening. Turiano shot a protester in the groin with a less lethal weapon. And that was caught simultaneously in a photograph which went viral around the country. You may have seen this photograph. No question, but the Turiano's use of force was appropriate. Nobody ever raised an issue with respect to that. But the protester, of course, sued. The attorney hired by the city to defend Turiano and other SWAT team members, the attorney asked them all for images of their cell phones. And by image, I don't mean a picture of the cell phone. I mean the entire contents of the cell phone, and promised them that the images would only be used for purposes of defending the lawsuit brought by the protesters. That case gets resolved. But then somebody, and it's not Turiano, makes up a challenge coin. I don't know if you've all seen these challenge coins that circulate through law enforcement. They're about the size of a silver dollar, and they commemorate usually a labor organization or an event in a law enforcement career. They apply as well in the fire service and the like. Well, somebody makes up a challenge coin that depicts a caricature of the protester being hit in the groin by Turiano's munition, along with the words, "Good night, left nut." And on the other side, the coin stated the date and location of the protest and the phrase, "Make America Great Again, one nut at a time." So the city then hires the outside law firm again to investigate this, to figure out who made up that challenge coin. Because apparently, "good night left side," not "good night left nut," but "good night left side" is an old skinhead phrase from the 1980s, mid-1980s in Great Britain. And someone in Phoenix thought there's some sort of relationship to neo-Nazi behavior or skinhead behavior. So the outside investigator, the outside law firm, does the investigation and concludes that they don't know who made up this challenge coin. They know it wasn't Turiano. So they just close their investigation. The employer then opens an internal affairs investigation into the challenge coin and demands access of the image of the contents of Turiano's cell phone in the investigation. And the question that goes to the court, and this is the third such case that we have had on public employee cell phones. The question that goes to the court is, what degree of privacy attaches to the personal cell phone of a public employee? And the court ends up finding a lot, relying on the Supreme Court's decision in a criminal case called Riley versus California. The court finds that cell phones are entitled to the highest degree of privacy under the Constitution, that the degree of privacy is at least equivalent to the amount of privacy that we have in our homes. And so the court says, A, in traditional privacy analysis, there's a reasonable expectation of privacy. The employer says, oh, but there's the workplace exception to that. You know, where we can go in and we can search desks and lockers and cars and things like that. And the court says, no, that workplace exception only applies to areas and items that are, first of all, related to work, secondly, and are generally within the employer's control. And a personal cell phone is not within the employer's control. And therefore, the court says, reasonable expectation of privacy, no workplace exception. For a public employer to demand access to a public employee's cell phone, you must have a warrant and probable cause. Wow, right? I mean, public employers, particularly law enforcement employers, are with increasing frequency wanting to examine the contents of an employee's cell phone, either because it might contain evidence of something that happened out on the street, or because it might be viewed as an instrumentality of a rules violation, whatever it might be. Warrant and probable cause. And that is actually the way the two previous cases came out, the most significant of which involved the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. So this is one where I think you're going to want to take a look at your policies and whether or not those policies allow the search of cell phones. The third case that I wanted to point your attention to is we have seen a significant additional crack in the armor on the Brady rule. For those of you unacquainted with it, Brady versus Maryland is a more than 50-year-old United States Supreme Court case. It holds that the prosecution in a criminal case must disclose exculpatory evidence to the defense. It's kind of a discovery obligation. And as it's happened over the years, lower courts have applied this Brady rule. Supreme Court has never applied it to a police case, but lower courts have. And they have said that if there is evidence of, in particular, dishonesty, some other reasons, in an employee's internal affairs or personnel files, though that evidence may have to be disclosed to the defense in a criminal case involving the officer. Some employers or some district attorneys have made up what are called Brady lists. And Brady lists is nothing more than a list of police officers for whom these sorts of disclosures have to be made. But we have a series of progressive prosecutors who've been elected around the country. One of them is Larry Krasner in Philadelphia. They take the Brady list notion up one level. As Emeril Lagasse used to say, they kick it up a notch. And they have a exclusion list where if you show up on this list, it's not just that the prosecutor will make disclosures to the trial court judge who'll figure out whether or not they're relevant and the circumstances under which the defense can see them. It's not just that disclosures will be made. Krasner and others who have a exclusion list say, we simply are never going to call this officer as a witness in any case. And what it is, at least from the perspective of law enforcement officers, it's a way for a prosecutor to basically act as the employer for decision-making purposes. Police officers react horribly to exclusion lists because it effectively means the end of their career. What the FOP did in Philadelphia, and this is a case that was decided earlier this year, I think this was decided in January or February of this year. And in this case, the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court, think Pennsylvania's Court of Appeals, ends up saying that the creation of this sort of exclusion list or even a Brady list violates due process unless the officers have the opportunity to challenge their placement on the list. And look at what the court is saying. Adequate due process requires an impartial tribunal before the officer is placed on the Brady list. And what about the prosecutor? Isn't the prosecutor a impartial tribunal? And if you look at the last bullet on the slide, the court says, no, it's not adequate to leave the decision to the very person the officers think mistakenly and unfairly placed them on the list in the first place. Expect to see more and more litigation around the country on Brady and due process. So those are the three cases that I thought you ought to take a look at and talk about internally. And if you're on the employer side, start thinking about what your policies are and maybe should be in all of these areas. Now I want to turn to the main topic of my presentation, which is the state of the national discussion on policing and the recruitment and retention crisis, and I'm not overusing that word, that we are facing in this country. And I want to start by an example of what's gone on in two places I think of as ground central for the discussion of defunding of police. One is Oakland, California. Oakland's geography is very unusual. Oakland is bisected by a freeway that runs north and south. And if you can imagine this, on the east side of the freeway, you have the hills that kind of come down from the Berkeley area past the Oakland area. You have an area that it has some of the highest assessed value of housing in the country up in the Oakland Hills. And you also have an area on the east side of the highway that is overwhelmingly Caucasian. On the west side of the highway, you have the flats. You have an area that is overwhelmingly African American, and you have an area where you have all sorts of poverty and lots of crime victims. In the wake of George Floyd's murder, the Oakland City Council once again cut police staffing. It has cut police staffing by about 40% over the years. And then it decided, let's see what the voters really think about our decision to cut staffing. And they commissioned a poll. And the poll had pretty interesting results. And the results were, broadly, 70% of the people who participated in the poll thought the city had made a mistake in its most recent round of budget cuts to the police department. 70%. But you know what? On the east side of the highway, the Oakland Heights area, overwhelmingly Caucasian, they thought the city had not made a mistake by cutting police staffing. That 70% number was driven by the people on the west side of the freeway, the ones who were the victims of crime. Interesting. And the city is going to try to restore police officers in result of that, not just that poll, but its highest homicide rate in a decade, but it can't. It is losing officers. And you can see this headline there's a real concern about diversity in the remaining workforce. I'll come back to that notion of diversity in just a moment. But it turns out that if you have a political environment that vilifies police officers as a class of employees, not calling out individuals like Derek Chauvin, but calling out police and attributing to them the motivations and conduct that we saw with respect to Chauvin. Turns out if you have that sort of political discussion, it's going to take years to undo that discussion, because police don't want to work in a place where their publicly elected officials do not want them. The second ground central is my home city of Portland, Oregon, a city that many of us have been very, very proud of for many years, and few of us say the same thing today. After George Floyd was killed, we had riots in Portland, real live riots, for over 100 nights in a row. What you are looking at is the downtown police precinct that is burning. This is another precinct that is burning. This is one in the lower income area of town that has been set on fire by this person that you see. They call themselves Antifa, but really what they are more than anything else is anarchists. And there's some place on the left wing and the right wing of our politics where you end up with anarchy. And so you can't even call these people left wing or right wing protesters. They just don't think anything of government. And there's a huge overlap between these people. Most of these people, by the way, were not from Portland. They were from outside of Oregon. They came to Oregon for the rioting. And there's a huge overlap between these folks, if you were to look at the Venn diagrams, and prior criminal convictions, and in particular, relationship to methamphetamine use. And there was about 100 to 200 of them. They were setting the fires. They were doing all of this. This is the office of the Portland Police Association, the police union in Portland. Fires were set there 12 times over the course of the riots. The Portland Police Association has had to move its offices. It actually owns that building. It can't sell it now. Had to move its offices outside of Portland into a suburb. And that's my law office. They apparently used Google, figured out where our law firm was, and came out one night, broke some picture windows, and spray painted that on garage doors. They probably meant to spray paint KKK OP, we're thinking. They just either ran out of room or misspelled it. And you can tell they knew who we were with the lawyer scum. Our law firm was attacked twice more, the third time with incendiary devices on a day when Antifa came to my partner's home at midnight. And we ended up having to move our law firm completely virtual and take away the opportunity to attack. So what happened in the middle of all this? Portland City Council voted to defund the police bureau, as it's called in Portland, by $15 million. It had been cutting back on funding on the police bureau for many years. When I started representing the Portland Police Association, it was 1979. We had about 1,000 sworn officers. Today, we have a little more than 750, and our population has more than doubled from 325,000 to 700,000. We have hundreds of vacant positions in the Portland Police Bureau. So what happens in Portland? Well, you know the story, right? 2021 turned out to be a record year for homicides. There was public discussion about, how meaningful really is a phrase like defund the police? Is that really a good phrase for marketing? The gun violence, the murders, increasingly impacted the homeless population. 70% of pedestrians who were killed in 2021 were homeless. Disproportionately, African Americans are being murdered. We're on a pace in Portland this year to set another new record for homicides. Even though we are a very white city, only 6% African American in Portland, over 50% of the homicide victims this year are African American. And so now we're talking about refunding the police. The department got 5 million back from 15 million that had been cut in the most recent budget cuts. We just had a poll that was done last week, and 82% of people in Portland thought that the size of the police department needed to increase. We're Portland. We all have our own opinions. I don't remember a poll ever saying that 82% of people could agree on anything other than we're better than Seattle. But beyond that, not really agree on anything. There's a Pew poll that shows that these public opinion trends are changing nationally. This is one from October 2021. Pew does this poll once a year, and it should be coming out in the next week or two. It'll be interesting to see the 2022 poll. But bottom line, you can see that by 2021, 47% of respondents thought that there needed to be more spending on police. 37% thought just about the same, and only 15% thought it should be decreased. I would anticipate those numbers will skew even more towards increase when we see the latest Pew poll. And the impact on staffing really is something else that cannot be understated. If you haven't seen it, there is a really, really important study called Police Force Size and Civilian Race. It was published in December 2020. This looked at just the US and looked at large police forces in the United States and examined the relationship between violent crime and the number of police officers. And what this study found, and I'll give you the site in just a moment, or I'll put it up there right now. What the study found was that every additional police officer abates approximately 1/10 of a homicide. So in other words, if you add 10 police officers, on the average, you're going to have one fewer homicide. If you cut 10 police officers, on the average, you're going to have one more homicides. If you look at it in per capita terms, the effects are twice as large for Black versus white victims. In other words, if you are Black, for every 5 police officers that you add or subtract, you influence 1 homicide. So rather than 10 for the population as whole, it's 5. If you've got a defunding or we need to reduce police discussion going on in your community, you need to take a look at this study published in the National Bureau of Economic Research. And a second study, excuse me, I took out the second study. So there's a bunch of headlines that we see around the country that I think is largely the product of this public discussion of policing and the toxic nature of that discussion, toxic rather than constructive, at least for those who are loudest, right? So headline from Oakland, and transit police are in trouble, dwindling numbers. St. Louis police, Spokane is a medium-sized city, 180,000 in Eastern Washington, staffing shortages, Capitol Police, Massachusetts Police Chiefs Association says no one wants to be a cop these days. We set a bunch of Google trawlers, Google News trawlers in our office. We get these headlines, multiple headlines every single day about staffing shortages around the country. We never used to see them. Here's some, I just dug some up in the last few weeks from Ohio. The Highway Patrol face a staffing shortage due to retirement and recruiting difficulties. Police agencies in Ohio relaxing tattoo policies for better recruiting. You can show they're very old-fashioned there because we don't call them tattoo policies anymore, right? We call them body modification policies. But in either case, they're getting relaxed. Here's something from the governor. Law enforcement agencies across Ohio are facing an increase in resignations and a decrease in new applicants. Governor DeWine says he's committed to supporting agencies that need to fill their ranks so they can protect their citizens. If he put any money behind that, I didn't see it, but it's at least a nice sentiment. Akron police relaxing facial hair. So bans on beards, and I don't know if they banned mustaches in Akron, but we're seeing this all over the country, a relaxation of facial hair policy, and we're discovering you can actually be a good police officer with facial hair. Dayton police, highest turnover in 7 years. You've probably seen the many stories of Cleveland and officer shortages and violent crime. Phoenix, I just had to pull this up for you, is having an event on November 6th in Cleveland to recruit for police officers. And here's the story.
There were 300 to 400 people taking the written test. We're lucky if we get 50 to show up now.
Phoenix PD says despite cash bonuses and incentives, they still do not get enough officers in the door. So now they're taking their surge to the Midwest. Kiara Hay is in studio. There's a law enforcement shortage nationwide right now. So what's different with recruiting from the Midwest? Well, being someone from the Midwest, they're hoping more people like me will ditch those snow shovels and instead bask in the sun here in Arizona. So right now, Phoenix PD is making a big push to get people in Ohio. And so far, it seems to be working. Officials with Phoenix PD say it's the perfect storm. More officers are retiring and fewer people are interested in getting into the force.
In the last couple months, July and August, we've only hired 9 and lost about 47.
To help get people in the door, Phoenix PD started offering $7,500 hiring bonuses. But so far, it's done little to help fill the current 250 openings. So now they're taking their search to Ohio.
This is something we're trying for the first time in a long time.
For the past month, Commander Charlie Consolian says Phoenix PD has promoted help wanted ads in the Buckeye State. But there's a potential problem. Cleveland is also short about 200 officers.
So hopefully, if they're not wanting to do law enforcement in Cleveland, maybe they want to do it in Phoenix.
Overall, the commander says the country is dealing with a lack of interest in becoming a cop. He says the shift happened in March of 2020, the same time as the death of George Floyd. Bert Otterkirk, who's been teaching law enforcement at Mesa Community College for more than a decade, agrees.
The way things have been lately with, what happened with Mr. Floyd and what happened with Mr. Brown and the other individuals, I think it's kind of making them shy away from that career, but it's not keeping them from taking classes because there's a lot of things you can do with an AJS degree that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be on the streets patrolling.
Otterkirk says his classes are still full, but many students are deciding to go into forensics. Commander Consolian says the department is in talks with universities and colleges to see why more kids aren't interested in becoming a cop. But in the meantime, he's hopeful their trip to Ohio in November will yield a good response.
Hey, go Ohio, come on.
Well, if everything goes as planned, Phoenix PD says its new recruits in the Valley in about a year. And it's not just Ohio. They also plan to expand to other Midwest states like Michigan and Illinois.
There were 300 to 400 people taking the. There were 300 to.
Okay, obviously you can't trust me with PowerPoint here. I did my best on that. It's interesting to hear him muse out loud about why it is that college kids aren't joining police forces and are going to other careers. I mean, let's just all ask ourselves that question. Think about the quality of the public discourse on policing wherever you are and what you see on television, what you see on social media. And ask yourself, in this economy that we have right now, where we can't hire enough people for a wide variety of jobs, in this economy, why would a 21-year-old woman or man with a college degree, why would they want to become a police officer? Why would they want to start off on the graveyard shift and work horrible hours and contend with suspects who at least occasionally attack them, resist arrest, call them all sorts of names, and then find their lives judged by the public based on a 3 or 4 second YouTube video that brings protesters to their house at night? And that's an equation that young men and women are actually considering right now. And they're voting with their feet. I mean, this is a huge problem. The Police Executive Research Forum has been trying to study this issue and make recommendations. PERF, if you're unfamiliar with it, is an organization. I kind of think of it as the big city police chief nonprofit organization. And they've got some good recommendations there. If you go to this book, you can find it online. Police Chief magazine, same thing, has several articles now published in the last couple of years on the workforce crisis. And this one happens to look at the relationship between the workforce crisis and crime and response times, but they also have tips on trying to recruit. This also from Police Chief magazine, where they found an increase of 279% in the number of resignations between June and December of 2020. Think about that for a moment. In policing, once you got into the career, you typically ended your career as a police officer, right? That's not true anymore. We have police officers around the country with 3 years on, 15 years on, long before their retirement ages, who are taking other jobs. And you can see the reasons attributed to it here are the increase in resignations linked to the Floyd protests occurring in whatever city they were. This is one large Western city, a hostile socio-political environment, and a perceived lack of political support. So how are agencies responding? They're responding by raising wages and at all levels of tenure. I have not seen wage increases the size that they are right now since the early 1980s, since 1982, 1981, when inflation was rising at the rate of 12%. And you see these raises at all levels of tenure. So adding additional steps on the top end of the pay scale, cutting off steps at the bottom end of the pay scale, so new employees start at a higher level of tenure. We're seeing the most aggressive lateral recruitment that I've ever seen. You just saw that news story on Cleveland versus Phoenix. Seattle is kind of the poster child, if you will. Here's a poster for recruiting. Seattle police set up a billboard that announced openings in the Seattle Police Department, saying something like this: come look for work for us. High wages, great pension plan, fully funded pension plan, beautiful area of the country. Where'd they put that billboard? Across the street from the headquarters of the Indianapolis Police Department. But word about the political environment in Seattle got out, and the result is they didn't get anybody from Indianapolis. They've since gone to places like Honolulu and not having much luck. But you see these sorts of posters all over the place now. This is one from Texas, Garland, Texas. Here's another one from Snohomish County, which is the county just north of Seattle. Here's one from Glendale, Arizona. Lateral officers. Notice in all of these, you are seeing people of color and women prominently featured in these. That's who we're targeting nationally for lateral hires and new hires in policing. Here's one that you see from the Antioch Police, which is a small village that is between Chicago and Milwaukee, where they're advertising their small town feel. And so you're seeing this push towards laterals all over the place. We're chasing the same set of experienced police officers around the country. The next thing that we're doing, and this is new really as of the last 3 or 4 months in any number, is we're seeing retention bonuses. You may ask, what's a retention bonus? In Phoenix, it is, if you stay around for 2 years, we'll pay you $7,500. No matter where you are on the pay scale, please just stay with us for 2 years. And you can see in Virginia Beach, which is a non-union environment, the retention bonus, $5,000. San Leandro, which is in the Bay Area of California, $20,000. I have seen retention bonuses of up to $30,000 now for hanging around, just simply hanging around for another 2 or 3 years. Notice the San Leandro retention bonus also targets dispatchers. It's not just police officers we can't recruit and retain. It's pretty much everybody in the police environment, and it's starting to bleed over a little bit to firefighters. But in particular, dispatchers and corrections officers have horrific recruitment and retention problems. You can see that Ohio is now, the state is offering pay raises, recruitment, and retention bonuses to troopers. This is after Jonathan Downs, a friend of mine from Ohio, managed to go to interest arbitration and convince an arbitrator not to give such raises. But now the state is unilaterally approaching the issue and doing it. The next thing that we're seeing is lowering the minimum education requirements for police. So you see here in Portland, we've relaxed the education standard. It used to be that in order to be a Portland police officer, you needed a bachelor's degree. Now, a GED will be just fine in order to be a Portland police officer. And this has significance. If you look at many publications from the Department of Justice, but also publications in academic journals, there are plenty of findings that show a positive correlation between increased college education and performance as a police officer. So as you get more college, you have fewer internal affairs complaints, fewer lawsuits, fewer excessive force claims, lower use of sick leave. It just goes on and on and on. And the notion that we are lowering minimum education requirements is actually something that I think we are going to seriously regret. With several of these things that we're talking about, we may well, and particularly the next one we're going to talk about, we may well look up 5 years, 10 years from now and say, what did we do? And why did we do this? And the next one is changing standards on things such as prior criminality. Do you know that there are some places in the South, these are all non-union states, where the fact that you have been convicted of a felony is not a bar to you becoming a police officer. It depends on the felony and how recently. I mean, you see that sort of thing and you think, what could possibly go wrong with doing that? Well, they're going to find out. As I mentioned, tattoo standards changing all over the country. Here's a good example. This is a recruiting poster, by the way, showing you, you can have ink and come to us. Unions are getting involved in recruitment. I've never seen that. This is from the Fort Worth Police Officers Association in Texas. And you can see who they're targeting, right? Come to work for a city that backs the blue. No vaccine mandates, no defunding police, supportive mayor and council, 4-year labor contracts. Then they get to one, meet and confer bargaining. I don't think that's going to attract anybody who's in a binding arbitration environment like Ohio. But if you're in a non-union environment, that might well attract you. Sustainable pension plan, civil service protection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Starting pay $63,000 after graduation from the police academy. So unions are getting involved. And I want to show you something. This is going to take a little bit of time, take about 4 or 5 minutes, but I think it's really worth it. This is kind of hot off the presses. Coral Gables is a good sized city in South Florida. It abuts the territory that is policed by what's known as the Miami-Dade Police Force. There is no sound on this video. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I want to give you a feel for it. This is a video that's put out by the Miami-Dade Police Department to try to poach Coral Gable police officers. Again, no sound, just drawing. Okay, that's probably enough. It goes on for a few more minutes, but that's a direct attack, right? And these things are coming. These things are coming around the country. Another impact that we have seen is, except in very, very few places, an end to pattern bargaining. So pattern bargaining is where the employer takes the position that everybody is going to get the same wage increase, across the board wage increase. We may go in, we may do a bracket adjustment or two, some places to adjust salaries, but overall, everyone's going to get the same 3%, 5%, whatever it might be, wage settlement. And pattern bargaining kind of used to be the rule in some big cities in the Midwest and in the upper Northeast. It's never really come to the western part of the United States or the southern part of the United States. Pattern bargaining is the reason that wages in the New York Police Department are so low. It's why a New York police officer with 15 years on the job can go across the Hudson River and make $40,000 a year more in the form of salary, because New York City follows pattern bargaining. And that recent Ohio trooper interest arbitration or binding conciliation award that I mentioned that Jonathan got, that was based on pattern bargaining. Well, pattern bargaining's going away. And the reason that pattern bargaining is going away, at least with respect to law enforcement, it's simple labor economics 101. What do you do if you need a given supply of goods or services and you don't have that level of supply? What you do is you increase the price that you pay for those goods and services. It's, like I said, that's labor economics 101. And that means we are seeing police called out for special raises, and we're seeing this just all over the country. This headline that you see here is from Annapolis, Maryland, and you can see that it expresses the disappointment of unions for firefighters, EMS personnel, and dispatchers who got 5% plus raises. Now, that's not a bad raise, a 5% raise. But why were they upset? Because the police got 19%. And this is something that is just repeated place after place after place. It's because there's not as much of a difficulty, particularly with firefighters. Recruiting firefighters as there is a difficulty with police. So just picture this in your head. Say you're a medium-sized employer and you want to recruit 20 employees. And let's say these are firefighters. And you put out a job announcement the way you normally would, open up applications on the internet. How many qualified applicants are you going to get for those 20 positions? Now, continue the thought problem. What if it's 20 police positions? How many qualified applicants are you going to get? And, you know, we probably all came up with different numbers, but I don't think any of us came up with a different direction. You're going to get vastly greater numbers of fire applicants than you will police applicants. I finished an interest arbitration earlier this year in Hawaii for Hawaii's police officers. They all bargain as one group. All of the counties bargain together. And one of the exhibits we had described the hiring process on Maui County. And Maui County in 2021 had over 1,200 applicants for the police position. When you got through with the written examination, how many showed up for that, how many passed it, and you got through job interviews and the background examination, the medical examination, and all of that over 1,200 applicants. Do you know how many qualified employees there were for the job? 6. Now, those are somewhat exaggerated statistics, but the direction of those statistics is not exaggerated. And these all contribute to pressures that are placed on the hiring process for employers. So at LRIS, Labor Relations Information System, which is the organization that publishes the books that I and others have written, and we have a monthly podcast, by the way, called First Thursday. You can find it on any of your podcatching services. We try to track average wage increases around the country for police and fire. These are not terribly accurate numbers. We get all of these from news articles, but as we have hundreds of samples for each year, you're probably in the ballpark as to what these numbers are. And you can see that for 5 out of the 6 years that we have listed, police wages have been raised or have increased at a rate that is higher than that of firefighters. And it's not a lot in any one year. 2018, 0.3%. And most recently for the upcoming year, so far we're at another 0.3%. But this compounds, right? And it compounds over time. There's really no such thing as police fire parity in this country anymore. And I would expect, and this is just spitballing it, I would expect that police wages in any city in this country, on the average, police wages will be at least 10% more than firefighter wages. That just wasn't the case 20, 30 years ago at all. And then the last point that I want to make is that even these wage amounts don't take into account the increasing propensity of employers and police unions to hide money in contract settlements. What do I mean by that? Employers have a lot of Me Too pressure, right? Me Too pressure from various unions, where if one union gets a wage increase, another union's going to be sitting on the sidelines and say, me too, we want that wage increase. It's kind of a pressure towards pattern bargaining, if you think about it. But these same employers are finding it very, very difficult to recruit police employees. And so what they are doing is putting money in the total compensation structure that is immunized relatively from the Me Too pressures. Kind of the old school on this is certificate pay for peace officers, standards and training commissions, licensing. These are police licensing boards around the country. Many of them give out certificates for intermediate and advanced status, depending on how much training and how many years you have on the job and college and everything like that. That used to be a pretty good place to hide money in a wage settlement, is to boost the amount of incentive you got for post certificates. New school, we're getting more creative. So here's one from San Jose, California. You get, it's now up to 3.75% crisis intervention training pay. Who gets crisis intervention training pay? Anybody who shows up on duty to take crisis intervention training. And that's not all. If you simply sign up for crisis intervention training, you get this now 3.75%. What percentage of the bargaining unit do you think gets crisis intervention training pay? 100%. And then my favorite, because I'm a little bit guilty as charged on this, is many years ago, 1998, we were facing a horrible retention problem in Hawaii for police because of the cost of living, in particular, the cost of housing. And the employers were under intense Me Too pressure. And so we came up with something we called standard of conduct differential. What did you need in order to get standard of conduct differential? If you were subject to the employer's disciplinary rules 24 hours a day, you got standard of conduct differential pay. In other words, 100% of the bargaining unit got this. It was only 25 cents an hour when we first negotiated it. But today, look at the amounts, $4 an hour. That's pretty significant. You know, that's $700 a month. And this is nothing more than finding a creative way to get the total compensation of police officers up so you can recruit and retain. And I'll tell you, just as a closing thought, I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel here. I don't see the recruitment and retention crisis easing at all. And as we move forward into the future, and we see more and more YouTube videos of police officers who are either using deadly force or having deadly force used against them, I think we're all going to have to be much more creative in how we try to get particularly educated, young people of color, anybody to become police officers. So with that, I've talked long enough. Any questions from anybody?
Well, we do have some questions, and I want to take you back to the cell phone case, because
Yes.
that caught a lot of attention to that. And one of the questions is that case still pending in the process?
Yeah, I haven't checked in a couple of months, but it was still pending as of a couple of months ago.
What is some of the insight for managers? You said that we should be checking for policies regarding the cell phone use.
If I were you, I would have a cell phone policy about the circumstances under which you could examine an employee's cell phone. And secondly, I'd have the procedure to examine the cell phone laid out in the policy. So what do I mean by that? I mean, first of all, you do not want the police department examining the cell phone. Send it out to a third-party forensic analyst. Be very, very specific in what you are looking for. Remember, we've got the Fourth Amendment. Your search can't go beyond the probable cause. So, you know, if you're looking for a sexually suggestive text message from October 7th, don't be looking at email. Don't be looking at photographs. Don't be looking at text messages from February. Treat it like a mandatory fitness for duty evaluation where you want the bare minimum to come back to you. If you do that, and always make sure you've got a lawyer somewhere in the loop before you force an employee to turn over a cell phone, that's, I think, going to be the best in the way of procedures you can have.
Okay. Also, I think it was Jonathan has joined us, and he asked that you restate the 3 case names at the beginning of the session.
Sure. The first is Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. That's the free speech case. The second was Turiano, T-U-R-I-A-N-O versus City of Phoenix. And that was the cell phone case. And the third was Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 5 versus City of Philadelphia. And that is the Brady List case. There's another Phoenix case. If you're interested in social media, there's another Phoenix case that just got decided a couple of months ago that calls into question the constitutionality of social media policies that prohibit criticism of the employer. And you ought to track down that case. It's the first federal court of appeals decision involving what was called the Plain View Project that collected and published offensive social media posts by police officers. And that Ninth Circuit opinion calls into question the constitutionality of most social media policies I've seen.
Okay. Are there any more questions? Will, could you stop sharing your screen so I can put you on full view for everyone?
Oh, I don't know that you want that. There we go.
There you go. Now, I know Elaine has made some comments in the chat, and I was going back through, Elaine, to see, was there a specific question or was it just comments? I guess it was just comments. Will, did you receive our thank you for COLERA?
Can't hear Elaine.
I did receive the
Oh.
thank you. Much appreciated.
Sorry, I was muted. No questions. I was just merely commenting because I sat on the opposite side of the table from Jonathan during those negotiations reference to the Ohio troopers. So, hi, Will. It's been a while since I've seen you.
Hi there, how you doing?
But we do want to thank you. That was an excellent presentation. And like Gwen, I also sat in some of your sessions along the way and just was very impressed with your overall engaging of the audience. And I thought you did an excellent job here today as well.
Thank you. Do I get more pens?
You to come back and speak more often.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for having me, folks. I'm going to check out now so you can do whatever business you have.
Thank you, Will.
Now, for the rest of us, our next session coming up is an in-person session at the Boathouse. Mike Duco is our presenter, and the topic will be, I'll remove that spotlight from you, Gwen, that's okay. And our topic